Yes, I have to say I've just recovered from COVID, so if my voice goes a bit sideways, you'll know why. Hang on.
Oh, but I'm glad you're okay, though.
Oh, look, I had the 4 injections for 3 days. I think I felt as though I was having an out of body experience. It was very odd,
Mm,
but
mm,
I also suffered 2 weeks prior to that from the 2022 flu. Now, if you
oh,
haven't been vaccinated against the flu, please do so. That really hurt. This
oh,
flu is awful, but I got through that. But the COVID was much easier, but it was a very strange experience.
mm,
Yeah, yeah.
mm.
Okay.
Okay,
Anyway,
right.
let's get stuck in, shall we? All right. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this episode, we are pleased to be joined once again by Dr. Ramzy Baroud. Ramzy is a US Palestinian journalist, media consultant, author, internationally syndicated columnist, and editor of the Palestine Chronicle. We'll be speaking to Ramzy on some of the themes of his latest book, Our Vision for Liberation, Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out, published by Clarity Press Inc. and the European Centre for Palestine Studies in May of this year. Ramzy, welcome back to The Focus.
Thank you for having me, John.
Ramzy, can you please tell our audience if anything significant has changed in Palestinian-Israeli relations since the political demise of Benjamin Netanyahu as Israeli Prime Minister and the ascent of his successor, Naftali Bennett?
I think that is indeed the case, but I don't think the changes are necessarily related to Netanyahu himself. Generally speaking, we tend to exaggerate the role of Israeli politics and how it influences the course of events in Palestine. But the argument that I have been making is that regardless of who rules Israel, whether from right, left, or center, at the end of the day, the events that are shaping the so-called conflict are really kind of largely out of Israel's control. And the best that Israel can do at this point is to basically respond to all of these events. And one of these very important events is that Israel's siege on the Gaza Strip, which was supposed to be kind of an attempt to showcase Israeli power, Israeli control, kind of perpetuating that whole carrot and stick strategy that they have been using with Palestinians for many years. It actually has failed. Not just that, it has backfired badly. And as a result, the various Israeli governments now are, kind of maintaining the status quo or promising that they will be the ones who will finally bring Israel that coveted security, and they have failed at it. They have failed at it because they assume that the security for Israel can happen at the expense of security, human rights, and justice for the Palestinians. So we are kind of reaching a point where the Palestinians are indeed becoming an important factor in Israeli politics. And when I say an important factor, I don't mean a factor that is basically manipulated for the sole purpose of gaining votes by various Israeli politicians, but rather a factor in the Palestinians' ability to actually influence the outcomes of Israeli politics through the strategic use of the resistance, as we have seen in May 2021, the diversity and the change of the course of the resistance as they find suitable, as we have seen in May of this year, and so on. So I think this is the major change that is happening. But really, regardless of who has ruled Israel since then, Netanyahu, Bennett, Lapid, it really, at the end of the day, it did not make a great deal of difference. Israeli politics continued. As always, the settlement enterprise continued to grow. As always, the apartheid regime continued to get rooted and worsens by the day. As always, but Palestinian resistance is changing its tactics. And that is, in my opinion, the new factor in all of this.
Could I be bold enough to suggest that perhaps settlement thinking on the Israeli side of the equation might have now really reached a point of becoming institutionalized, that you can't ever see an Israeli prime minister or someone in the Israeli cabinet suggesting an alternative course? You know, it's part of the Knesset fabric now. They can't move away from it, can they?
That's a perfect assessment. And this assessment has been particularly acknowledged. I don't think there is any serious political party in Israel or analyst who would say that it's actually otherwise. The Labour Party, which at one point championed some sort of a negotiated compromise, and don't misunderstand me, I am no fan of the Labour Party, and I think it's the cowardice of many members of the Labour Party in Israel that really kind of led to the mayhem of today and opened up the margins for the likes of Netanyahu, Bennett, Shakid, Lieberman, and others on the right and the extreme right, and the ultra-nationalists, to kind of have their day in power. If they did stay the course and had any inkling for a serious compromise with the Palestinians, I don't think we would have reached that point. But they tried to use the so-called peace process to manipulate Palestinians and to kind of maintain the status quo of that came previously to the peace process. And at the end of the day, not only they lost everything, they also lost their hold on power. This is the very party that established Israel until the late 1970s. They don't exist anymore as a serious political contender in any Israeli Knesset general elections. So here we are kind of moved further to the right in Israel. The vast majority of Israelis identify in one way or another as members of the right ideology. And therefore, everybody had to redefine his role. The center in Israel, for example, the blue and white, among others, had to adopt the language of the right in order for them to have a chance at winning some votes. If there is any difference between Israel's current political formations and the various political ideologies and parties, the issue is largely socioeconomic. It's about jobs, it's about social equality, and so forth. But nobody is really talking about a peace process, a Palestinian state, ending apartheid, ending occupation, freezing the settlements. To the contrary, anybody who would dare touch any of these issues could be basically the death knell in terms of their political careers. So yes, that assessment is unfortunately very much true.
You know, it's interesting. When the Israelis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis signed the Abraham Accords, I having lived in Abu Dhabi, I was very happy. I was happy for the reason that I thought that things would turn out better for the Palestinians, because then you would have Arab states on the inside track with the Israelis, and maybe they'd be able to do some horse trading. Maybe they'd be able to come up with a deal in which Israel would then have to recognize Palestine in a way that they couldn't before, because Israel was frozen out of the Arab international system, right? This hasn't come to pass, which leads one to suspect that there is some room for disappointment in all of this from a Palestinian perspective. What are your thoughts?
The normalization between these specific Arab countries and Israel, in a sense, yeah, of course, it was disappointing because our relationship as Palestinians is largely not with Arab governments, but with Arab people. I mean, we live, we work, we coexist with them in the Gulf, in every part of the Middle East. And, the impression that you get one opinion poll after the other says that the Arabs are on your side. In fact, I wrote an article about this very recently. Don't write off the Arabs yet, because indeed, like for example, 88% of all Saudis say that Palestine is not just the issue and the cause of the Palestinians, is the cause of all Arabs. 87% of Qataris, I think something like 82% of Emiratis, if I remember correctly. There is no question in the minds of ordinary Arabs that Palestine is a fundamental issue from a political point of view, from a cultural, from a spiritual, from a historical point of view. So to see that normalization, and it's happening in such a vulgar way, I mean, so vulgar to the point that during the recent Israeli war on Gaza, the Emirati and Bahraini embassies in Tel Aviv issued statements to their citizens who are tourists or diplomats in Israel, saying that in order for you to avoid getting yourself into any sort of trouble, make sure that you follow the instructions coming from the Israeli government. I mean, this is so vulgar. It's like they have switched sides in the matter of days. The language, the political discourse has fundamentally shifted, as if the Emiratis are suddenly our enemies. But the fact is, the Emiratis are not our enemies. And the Emirate has never really been in a state of war with Israel in the first place. Why are they signing peace agreements? Peace agreements are only an outcome of conflict. The Emiratis, the Bahrainis, they haven't really been in a state of conflict with Israel. I mean, from a legal and political and functional point of view. So this whole thing has taken many Palestinians by surprise. But then when you kind of try to think about it from a rational point of view, we know that these little, countries, if you will, states, protectorates, they've always operated based on the mere desire to survive. And there is this inflated threat of the Iranian menace that's coming with the Shia population throughout the Middle East, and they are, hell-bent on taking over. And that threat has been exaggerated so much that the Emiratis had made the exchange, not the exchange you were referring to earlier, as for we normalize, as the Saudis have, resolved in 2002 in the Arab Peace Initiative that was ratified by all Arab governments. We will normalize with you once the Palestinians are granted a state and once there is a peace agreement that is suitable for the Palestinians and consistent with international law. No, the exchange was something else entirely. It was, you protect us against Iran, the Americans give us, jet fighters, and we give you everything you need regarding Palestine. But the argument I've also made about this is that this is ultimately useless because, number one, as I said, you are not really in a state of conflict, so you haven't really resolved anything. And number two, Israel is now realizing that the role of the United States, Washington's position in the Middle East is changing. The US is in a state of retreat. China has greater influence over Iraqi economy, for example, than the US ever has. And therefore, Israel is trying to think regionally as opposed to internationally. The American benefactor is not going to be there for long. And Israel is realizing its relationship and its survival depends on its relationship with the Arab world. So this is really the challenge for us Palestinians. We can't allow them to achieve that sort of regional power, hegemony, if you will, and sustain it for long while Palestine is being completely marginalized. But on the other hand, if Israel has reached the conclusion that it needs its Arab neighbors, then maybe at one point we can actually reach that kind of compromise. Fine, you can be part of a greater Arab body politic and geopolitical game, but in order for that to happen, Palestinians would have to be granted their rights fully. International law would have to be respected fully. And we have to find a formula for coexistence somehow. And that coexistence can only happen when the Palestinians are part of whatever political calculations that the Arabs and Israel have in mind.
Speaking about geopolitics, from an international relations perspective, all eyes seem to be focused on the Russian-Ukraine war or on the Taiwan Strait tensions. Is this a problem for the Palestinian movement, or is it an opportunity?
I think both. I think if it is an opportunity, if Palestinians know how to utilize this opportunity, and if they don't, then it's not status quo. It's not going back to business as usual. It will hurt Palestinians if they do not get involved. Now, let me tell you why Palestinians are hesitating a little bit regarding this. One of the main reasons of their hesitance is what happened in 1991 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, Yasser Arafat, tried to play geopolitics. In defense of the man, he is dead now, but in his defense, he really did not take Iraq's side 100% as it's being promoted and it's written in history. But at that point, there was a situation, there was some sort of a political equation that dictated that if you do not stand 100% on the side of the American war in defense of Kuwait, and of course, that's not exactly the case. The Americans had their own political calculations. Then you are on the side of Saddam Hussein. Yasser Arafat tried to play some sort of a geopolitical game or say, listen, the Americans cannot resolve our problems. And he's right. I mean, eventually the Americans came back to Iraq and killed millions of Muslims and Arabs in that region, right? So his idea was, let the Arab world resolve this. Let's activate the role of the Arab League in particular to resolve this issue. And of course, it backfired badly on Palestinians. I don't think there's a single Palestinian who doesn't have an auntie or an uncle or a relative of some kind who did not pay a price for that decision. Those who have been pushed out of Kuwait, other Gulf countries, they lost everything. Many of them were killed at one point when Iraq was pushed out of Kuwait and so forth. So many Palestinians are hesitating, thinking we don't want this geopolitical game to happen at our expense. We don't want the Iraq-Kuwait scenario to be repeated. We don't want the Syria scenario to be repeated, as was the case in Yarmouk. But on the other hand, the Palestinian leadership needs to understand that this is a game changer. This is not a minor event that is happening at a regional level. This is a world that is changing fundamentally for many years and perhaps decades to come. And regardless of the outcome of this war, there will be a new world order, and there will be new camps, whether bipolar or multipolar. So the Palestinian leadership, I think it behooves Mahmoud Abbas and his so-called leadership to really rethink their current course of action. I know that they are getting some, handsome funds from Washington that is keeping their apparatus running, but those funds are not going to last for long, and they always come at a very heavy political price. Is there an opening? Yes, there is. I know that Hamas has visited Moscow. They met with top officials in the Russian government. And I know that Mahmoud Abbas and his leadership have tried to find some kind of a balanced language as far as Russia and the US conflict is concerned. For example, the Americans have been pushing the Palestinians to take a fully pro-American position regarding this. And to his credit, Abbas refused to do so because he knows that doing so could be considered a political suicide in a region that is trying to find the geopolitical balance as well. But the question is, how far can they actually play that geopolitical game? And in order for you to play this game, you have to have assets. You have to have some sort of leverage that you can actually bring to the table. And I do think that the Palestinians have that leverage. It's just the question is, will they risk using it not knowing the outcome in advance.
You made mention that Mahmoud Abbas visited Moscow. The last time we spoke, we looked at how Russia has been a consistent international friend of the Palestinian movement. So has Putin's war on Ukraine affected Moscow's ability to lend support to the Palestinian cause?
Right. Just a tiny correction. I might have, maybe you couldn't hear me very well. I said it was Hamas that visited Moscow.
Sorry.
But that doesn't mean that Mahmoud Abbas, he has a very strong and, an ongoing relationship with Putin, and Lavrov in particular has been a very strong friend of the Palestinian people. But the problem is, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is, politics is not wishful thinking. Politics is again, is what do you actually bring to the table, and how can you exchange that kind of power into political leverage? And Russia found itself in a position of the cheerleader. They wanted to be on the table of the Madrid talks, for example. They are members of the so-called Quartet for Peace. They are there. They are making their presence. Quite often they make a statement that, again, pro-Palestine, but also slightly more cautious than during the times of the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, they really haven't affected outcomes. Russia's role in all of this hasn't really been tangible. There have been some attempts, by the way, by Moscow to get involved in a more serious way. They invited Fatah and Hamas leaders to Russia at one point a few years ago to talk about national unity. The Palestinians obliged, nothing good came out of it. The Americans threatened the Palestinians that you cut it out. Russia is not part of this. The Americans and Washington is the only address as far as the peace process is concerned. The Palestinian Authority tried to manipulate the US for a bit more money in the process, but at the end of the day, it really did not lead to anything serious. Now, the question is, the outcome of what is happening in Ukraine and Russia's growing import and growing involvement in the Middle East region, in North Africa, in East Africa. They are clearly trying to play a long-term game. And Palestine, Israel is a very important part of this game. So I think that the Russians are keen on trying to push and occupy all the available margins, taking advantage of the complete lack of credibility and dishonesty of Washington as a peace broker. And they will try to play this game in the long run. Now, will they be able to reclaim their role of the past? Will they become the benefactors, if you will, of the Palestinian liberation movement, as they have done, and in some ways successfully in the past? I think that is a question that is left to be seen. I think events are moving so very quickly that the language that the Russians are using regarding Israel and Palestine is so different than the language that they have maintained since the early 90s. For example, they refer to Israel's latest war on Gaza as a war that was triggered by Israel. I mean, they are giving full moral and legal and political responsibility to Israel for that war. They usually don't use that language, and that language is evolving by the day. And we are following, just basic discourse analysis shows that Russia is really changing its rhetoric and the overall political discourse on Palestine and Israel. How far will that go? Again, depends on many variables that are changing regularly.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with author, journalist, and editor of the Palestine Chronicle, returning guest Ramzy Baroud. Ramzy, on August the 7th, Israeli forces attacked Gaza, an attack that Israeli defense officials have formally acknowledged, and one that killed 5 children. So long as these types of raids against Gaza and elsewhere in the Palestinian territories continue, how difficult is it to maintain hope?
Well, hope is there's a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, the great Palestinian national poet, who said that we have an incurable disease called hope. And I thought of that poem when immediately after that war that killed 49 Palestinians, including 17 children, by the way. I was watching this video that was sent to us by our cameraman in Gaza, the Palestine Chronicle cameraman in Gaza. And it was the title something like the beach, the Gaza beach. And I didn't know what would that video be, and the Gaza beach could be anything. Palestinians finding bodies in the rubbles on the Gaza beach, for example. But it wasn't. It was thousands of Palestinians just spending time on the beach with their umbrellas and their barbecues, and children laughing, swimming, playing. It was incredible. And it got me thinking about the question of hope and this incurable disease of ours called hope, that just within the matter of hours, once truce was declared, you have Palestinians kind of clinching life back with so much tenacity. I mean, this is the very Palestinian relationship with hope. I don't think that's going to change. If it hasn't changed at times when Israel killed 2,500 Palestinians in a single war, wounded 15,000 people, destroyed half of the Gaza Strip infrastructure. If it hasn't changed Palestinian relationship with hope, I don't think this war is going to change it, or, by the way, any future war as well. But I think that the challenge is for the Israelis at this point, because they have learned the limits of their military might. Military power is used to exact changes on the ground, whether political changes or long-term geopolitical changes, but it is something that is meant to change some kind of reality. They have failed. They are stuck for years. They keep playing the same card, the same game, and the outcome, not only the outcome doesn't seem to change, but Palestinian tenacity, resistance, and hope becomes stronger and stronger. And I'm really not trying to romanticize this. I am looking at this from the viewpoint of a people's historian, talking to numerous people, interviewing people in Gaza, in Palestine, constantly. And this is the message that keeps emanating out of Gaza, that there will be no defeat. Don't expect a defeat or a white flag to be pulled out or waved anytime soon in this battle. We are here for the long haul, and I think the question is now left for the Israelis. Will they carry on with these violations of human rights, these massacres, these targetings of children and civilian infrastructure, or have the courage just to mature, to grow up, to think that this can't be a long-term solution? And maybe it is time for us to rethink this entire violent strategy once and for all.
What never ceases to amaze me in this conflict is the fact that the Israelis have been on war footing basically since the foundation of Israel. Now, there is a case to be said that, well, obviously it would be, because they took Arab land by force, and so therefore they had to defend by force their position in the Middle East. But is there not a sense of war weariness among Israelis? I mean, among the Israelis that you speak to, do you have a sense that it's not kind of as clear cut as we would like to think? Like, you've got the Israeli government, they keep on battering away at the Palestinians, and somehow by that alone, the Israeli government has the tacit support of all its people behind them. Is that true after all this fighting? Aren't the Israelis just tired of it?
Well, I mean, you would be tired of it if you are paying a price for it. Tel Aviv, when Gaza was in flames, Tel Aviv wasn't. People were still going to nightclubs and going to the beach and all of that. And yes, of course, there's the occasional, siren, and people would have to run to the shelters. But once you get used to that sort of thing, especially when you hear such statements by former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he had that famous statement that's often quoted, something to the effect of, "I am often asked, will Israel continue to live by the sword?" Then there was this pause, and he goes, yes. So there is that that element. Okay, we have to live by the sword. But this is also kind of quite dangerous, because Israel can only live in this condition. They have to have a very large sword, and the Palestinians have to have no sword at all. That's really what it's all about. Remember Bill Clinton, whenever he used to give Israel extra military hardware, he used to always make, he coined that statement, we need Israel to continue to have military edge over the Arabs. That's the thing. So it has to be military edge. It has to be a very large sword. What is troubling for Israelis, and this is why there is a bit of panic in Israel, and this is why Yair Lapid, the prime minister of today, was so keen on ending this war very, very fast, which is not in Israel's nature. Israel's nature prolonged the war to teach the Palestinians a lesson, to so-called mow the grass, destroy the so-called terrorist infrastructure. And, we are back. We have this reset button, and that will buy us a year, 2, 3, and then we do it again and again and again. But why were they so keen on ending this war so very quickly? I mean, the war was against a small Palestinian group called the Islamic Jihad. It wasn't against Hamas, which is essentially a resistance army now in Gaza. They know that they cannot win a long war anymore. And that is extremely troubling for Israel. So the challenge for the Palestinians is to, they will never be able to raise a sword as large as that of Israel. But they will be able, and they are able, to create the kind of impact that they can completely destabilize Israel, as what happened in May 2021. Israel shut down all of Israel's airports, ceased on functioning. Tourism was a thing of the past in Israel. All the major ports, major factories, everything had to come to a complete stop. For an economy like Israel, they couldn't afford that. They were losing billions of dollars, and they could not achieve anything on the military front. So that is, I think, Israel's biggest challenge. They would love to go back to the days of the past, to the second intifada of 2000 to 2005, when life was so easy. They just go and they bombed and they assassinated, and they had a list of people, and they would put the list in newspapers, large inserts in the newspapers of how many people they have taken out with big axes every day on the number of Palestinians who were assassinated. This is not happening. This is not the case anymore. And that is something we really need to pay very close attention to. Back to Netanyahu's swords. Yes, they will continue to have to live by the sword, but there will be a point in which they have to make a choice. Maybe we need to put the sword down and talk to the Palestinians and give them some dignity, some respect, some basic human rights. Otherwise, the Palestinian sword has been unleashed, and the Palestinians called, by the way, they called their May 2021 revolt, which happened in every type of resistance in every part of Palestine. They called it the sword of Jerusalem. Well, I think it's quite ironic, actually. Now the Palestinians are using the term sword, and it's not because the Palestinian military capabilities are now matching that of Israel, but the Palestinians realize that they have so many cards as well. The popular rebellion in Israel, Palestine 48 itself, the popular rebellion in Sheikh Jarrah, Salwan, and East Jerusalem, the instability in the West Bank, and the resistance in Gaza. Somehow, they all coordinated these actions together. They put so much pressure on Israel, to the point that Israeli media was saying that we have never experienced anything like this since the so-called Liberation War of 1948. So no Arab war that has happened anywhere in between could compare to what actually happened is in May 2021. And I think that's very, very critical to this analysis.
Is this what they call the Unity Intifada?
That's the Unity Intifada. And that's, again, this is a very interesting concept here, because we've been talking about unity. We got sick and tired of talking about Palestinian unity. But in my defense, I did make the argument that we need to quit talking about unity as if some sort of a factional factional unity between Hamas and Fatah, between Palestinian leaders in Gaza and Palestinian leaders in the West Bank. My argument that this is not real unity. This is just some sort of a political agreement or compromise like any other government when they have these sort of unity governments and what have you. Real unity for a liberation struggle like that of the Palestinians is the unity of the people, the regions, the areas, the cities, the towns. And that's indeed what happened, in not only in the occupied territories, by the way, but within Israel itself, within Palestinian cities and towns, within Israel, within Palestine 48. Not just the unity of action and the coordination of this action, but also the unity of the language, which is unprecedented. You have young people in Haifa, Jaffa, Nazareth, speaking the same language of people in Gaza, the same political discourse in people in Nablus, Ramallah, and Al-Khalil in the West Bank, and the same language as that of East Jerusalem. That is a fundamental change. And when the truce was declared, after the 10-11-day war in May 2021, the celebration of the Palestinian communities throughout occupied Palestine, but also in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria. That was the true unity of that intifada. And that unity remains in place until today. And my only hope is that we are able to eventually yield a new Palestinian leadership that taps into this unprecedented unity, build something on it, and actually have a unified political front as well.
So if we can return specifically to your book now, Ramzy, could you summarize for our audience what the main themes in your book tend to put forward?
Well, the main idea that we try to communicate here is when we talk about solutions and future visions, we need to walk away from this overemphasis on one state, two states, and that sort of thing. This is academically interesting, helpful, but that's not how liberation movements work, and that's not how countries get liberated. What countries become liberated when there is some kind of a unity of the narrative, of the political discourse, when we all more or less agree to some fundamentals. In Palestine, we call it al-thawabit al-wataniya, which means the national constants. They are unchanging, regardless of time and place or generation. So this book was some kind of an attempt of starting a new conversation that offers and maybe reactivate or create new national constants. It's not an alternative to any Palestinian constitution of any kind. It's not speaking on behalf of the people by those who were not elected by the people. But it is there to show, number one, the diversity and the complexity of the Palestinian view. This is not about answering such silly questions as, where is your Palestinian Gandhi? And, are you with this kind of violent resistance versus non-violent resistance? That's not the conversations we Palestinians have. I don't recall ever being engaged in a conversation of that kind within an exclusive Palestinian intellectual body. We entertain these kind of silliness, these kind of academic conversations outside Palestine because we have no control over the narrative, and the narrative is controlled by someone else. So the idea that Ilan Pape and I had is, what if we start the conversation and we bring people to engage in this conversation, not based on their political ideology per se, or their faction per se, or their gender, or their region. No. These are Palestinians who have lived and experienced their own struggle for liberation in numerous fields, whether in archaeology, in the media, in the fight for equal rights, ethics of liberations, the actual language, the actual discourse, medicine, science. All of these are struggles for liberation, and they have to be included in that conversation. So we have this seemingly wild idea of bringing them all together and create some sort of a unified Palestinian text in which each one of these engaged intellectuals, and that's very, very important to the book. These are not people who are involved in theory. These are not people who are involved in discourse analysis, detached from the struggle. No, these are experts in these subjects, but these people who were actually involved, lived the struggle, were deported from Palestine, imprisoned, tortured, lost loved ones, fought against Israeli soldiers at every corner of the West Bank and Gaza. And we bring them together to tell us about their experiences and hope that people would engage with it, agree with some, disagree with others, but understand that there is a large and diverse and exciting Palestinian narrative or narratives that should lead the discussion on the future of Palestine and on the issue of liberation. And by the way, we chose the term liberation, for a purpose. This whole emphasis on the peace process and peace solutions and all of that, they were coined and selected carefully to actually distract us from the real fight that any nation like the Palestinians have to be focused on, and that is a fight for liberation. So we are here talking about actual national liberation. We are talking about decolonization from an academic point of view. You have about 30 Palestinian intellectuals from the West Bank, Gaza, Palestine 48, former Knesset members, for example. We have great Palestinian intellectuals from Australia, from Canada, from Chile. We have the head of the Chilean Palestinian community that's really led one of the greatest Palestinian success stories anywhere outside the Middle East. About 500,000 Palestinians living in Chile, thriving, politically thriving, influential in every aspect of life, including sports. They have one of the top sports team in Chile called the Palestinos, Deportivo Palestinos. And we wanted to talk to these guys. What did you do right? And why are you still so connected to Palestine after all of this time, despite of all of this distance? And the task was that challenging task to bring them all together in a way that as if they are all having a conversation with one another. And it was such we were so happy with the outcome, to the point that within the matter of weeks, we had an Arabic edition, just came out. French, Spanish editions are being translated as we speak. So there was so much thirst and so much anticipation for that Palestinian viewpoint and Palestinian discourse from so many people around the world, that they are kind of really looking forward, as Angela Davis says in her endorsement of the book. We were waiting for the Palestinians to tell us. Not only to tell us what they want as far as their own liberation, but to also lead us in the struggle for justice and human rights around the world.
It seems very much like this is the next step in the evolution of the Palestinian struggle, really, which leads me to the next thing, and that is that we've spoken about this before, Ramzy. The Palestinian people are some of the youngest people in the world, but its leadership is very, very old. And obviously the Unity Intifada seems to provide evidence that there is generational change that is on its way. And that generational change is quite prepared to think outside of the box, to put the old views aside. They did not work. So now it's time to actually reconstruct something different, something for the next generation to grab hold of and hopefully to do something with, yeah?
It's interesting you mentioned the generational divide and the generational struggle. That kind of terminologies and similar to the class struggle in Palestine, we rarely discuss this. It is so very important. In fact, sometimes they are the overriding values on any discussion about Palestine within Palestinian society. But we tend, generally speaking, to kind of seek easy answers, reductionist terminologies, and we feel, this is satisfying enough for this kind of political conversation. But you're right. Not only now, the generational struggle has been a defining moment throughout the struggle for Palestinian liberation throughout history. The best example for that was the first Palestinian Intifada of 1987. That's when the youth of Palestine took it upon themselves to basically reclaim the revolution. And they did so after the defeat of the PLO in Lebanon, after they were pushed out of Lebanon, and after the PLO was segmented to numerous little offices and organizations throughout the Middle East, and they had their headquarters in Tunisia. And Palestinians felt truly orphaned. They had no real leadership speaking for them. If they had leadership, it was leadership in name only. So they took that responsibility and they created their alternative leadership. We called it, let's see if I can translate this correctly, Al-Qiyada Al-Wataniya Al-Muwahhada Lil-Intifada, the unified national leadership of the Intifada, of the uprising. And then they divided that responsibility between numerous grassroots organizations operating in every refugee camp, in every town, in every city throughout Palestine. They coordinated their messages, they went on strike collectively, they fought collectively, and so forth. And that's what was when the Oslo Agreement was signed. Because the old leadership, the old guard, if you will, were feeling truly threatened. They were losing the narrative. They were losing, their control over the masses in Palestine. Yes, of course, there are some academics who discussed this, but it's not part of our everyday discussion on Palestine, how there is that generational divide and generational struggle. And of course, you have the class struggle, which is very, very important. Notice how when Palestinians put everything on the line, that usually comes from the refugee populations of Palestine, from the refugee camps. The vast majority of fighting Palestinians are refugees. We don't talk about the class struggle. This is one thing we try to actually do in the book. We tried to talk about the class struggle. We talked about the generational issue and so forth. Now, the question is, but why, if there is so much drive for change in Palestinian society, what keeps the old guard in control? Because the old guard have sponsors, they have benefactors, they have money. The Palestinian Authority alone is the largest employer in Palestine. Over 30% of all Palestinians, according to numbers from a few years ago, are hired by the Palestinian Authority. It means that the car loan that you have to pay, the rent that you have to pay, the food you have to buy for your children comes from the Palestinian Authority. You have no respect for it. You have no admiration for its leaders whatsoever. But some Palestinians find it extremely difficult to walk away from that and put everything back on the line and to risk losing everything. So that's why the old guard remains in place. And that's why the challenge for this young generation is particularly compounded. They are fighting against the old guard. They are fighting against a ruling class that is inundated with funds coming from the US and its allies, but also fighting against the armed settlers and the Israeli army and this incredible system of apartheid that is so sophisticated that it really seems rooted in every aspect of life for the Palestinians.
I have to ask this final question, Ramzy, and that is, Palestinian people are scattered all over the world. As you had rightly pointed out earlier, you've got them in Australia, you've got them in Chile, you've got them everywhere, as well as in the Palestinian territories. From an outsider's perspective, looking at this massive Palestinians all over the world, do they all think along the same lines? Can they be brought together under this unity intifada ticket, if you will? Or do you find that those who live perhaps in the more advanced economies are a little bit more self-absorbed, shall we say? They may care for their local community, but maybe not so much for the people back home because that's all too complex and it's, maybe a couple of generations ago and all that kind of thing. How do you find this whole situation? Yeah.
Honestly, Palestinians are like any other people in some respects and different in others. And I can discuss it very briefly of why I think that is the case. Of course, they are subject to class formations and class struggles. Palestinians in Qatar, for example, are different than Palestinians in Egypt. They are under different political regimes, different political language. At times they barely try to survive. At times they take advantage of whatever margins and political spaces available to them, and they organize and they mobilize. And there are rich Palestinians and there are poor Palestinians. There are Palestinians who are part of class struggles in the United States, for example, Italy, France, Spain, and there are Palestinians who are close to the power and they would, they are very wealthy, they have businesses they want to maintain. So they are not really fundamentally different than other people when they are under similar stimuli. What makes them different in some respects, and that is something that you can only, and this is why I ended up resorting to people's history in order for me to answer this question in my book, The Lost Earth. What makes us different? Why are the wealthy Palestinians of Santiago, for example, who are quite wealthy and well connected to power, why are they still keen on the idea of Palestine? Why are they still unified behind the Palestinian struggle at home? From a class point of view, they should have moved on a long time ago, but they haven't. What keeps them connected? And I think there is something that makes Palestine, the vulnerability of Palestine and the Palestinian people. The fact that 75 years of Israeli occupation, the destruction of the Palestinian homeland, 55 years of Israeli occupation, 100 years of colonialism, the whole world seems to just towing the line of the United States. Israel is more violent by the day, yet somehow there's this incredible energy of resistance that is inherited from one generation to the other that doesn't go away. The symbolism, the poetry, the art, the memories, the love for Palestine that you kind of see communicated by grandmothers and fathers to their children, that emotional elements that, enough attention to feelings and emotions in our discussions and our analysis of history, but we have to. And I think that is really the element here, is the feelings and the emotions of Palestine are so inspiring and so powerful. So yes, you have the Palestinians who deviate based on their class interests, based on their political geography, and based on distance and time, but somehow they always gravitate back. Every time there is an intifada, every time there is a war, they always come back, they get their flags, they go to the streets of Santiago, Paris, London, or Cairo, and they chant for Palestine. And that's what keeps them going and keeps that kind of relationship with Palestine strong throughout the years.
Ramzy, again, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for being with us again on The Focus. Shukran.
Thank you very much, John. And thanks to all of your wonderful team, and happy to be back.
Thank you. Thank you. Author, journalist, and editor of the Palestine Chronicle, Dr. Ramzy Baroud. His book, Our Vision for Liberation, Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out, can be found at your local bookstore or favorite online purveyor of the written word. I encourage you to get a hold of a copy. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our returning guest, Ramzy Baroud, and producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. So if you like what you've heard, please like and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus.